It's time to do.
If you've been on my channel for a while, you've noticed that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a franchise that I've really been going into a lot lately, though we've been actually focusing more on the characterization of the series casts. This channel is still classified as the game-based one though, and we've gone through a number of the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Games, which we'd like to continue on today. Forbidden Memories, Duelist of the Roses, Falsebound Kingdom, Dungeon Dice Monsters, Capsule Monster Coliseum, and Rechef of Destruction. Yu-Gi-Oh! Games back in the day were just built differently, man. Especially for tie-in games. That isn't to say these games are perfect. I've literally made over 3 hours worth of content to express why these games are at the very least interesting romps and foretaste into the honestly vast world of Yu-Gi-Oh! With some interesting changes to the core elements of the original card game. But there are still things that hold them back from being extremely great games. Whether it be a lack of actual challenge, the grind of games to make it more of a chore to complete it, or the game just outright cheats. You bastard! There are things that ultimately hold back what I believe can be some great games here. There's a lot of potential in the core elements of these games that I truly believe hasn't been hit on yet. Dungeon Dice Monsters, a game that honestly has a lot of potential to it, was gimped by some bad mechanical choices and Konami being run by absolute brainlets who think charging $15 for a single poorly made mini and nearly $30 to $40 for a starter set was a good idea to get the game going. Duelist of the Rose was a game that I do love and play when I have spare time to this day, but lacks a lot of polish and development that could make it into a classic. And Forbidden Memories, that game just makes me mad. That's not even getting into the fact that there are some games that we in the West have never even gotten our hands on, at least not in the official way. There were actually quite a few translations out there, including for today's game too, made by a guy named I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name to save my life! But said game actually got an official English release with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Early Days collection. And I'll say this, it's probably one of my favorite Yu-Gi-Oh! Games I've played and reviewed thus far. I'm MangaKamen, and this is Yu-Gi-Oh! Monster Capsule GB.
It's time to duel and there's no backing down. The heart of the cards is where magic is found.
That's fun. Fuck.
This here's the story of a man. Well, not so much a man as a boy.
Before we can actually talk about the game, we need to talk about Yu-Gi-Oh's original manga in Season 0. Most people who think of Yu-Gi-Oh honestly think to the card game, which, hey, considering that this franchise has been going on for 25 years at this point, isn't hard to believe that. Most of us are probably already acting like the Reaper of Cards is floating behind us, waiting for a moment when we let down our guard. Yu-Gi-Oh! Season 0 was the Japanese-only version of Yu-Gi-Oh! That covered the earlier portions of the original manga. Somewhat. There is a fair bit of adaptation being done, like taking a single-chaptered character and making it a full-blown side one. We don't talk about that garbage fire. The premise for the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Was that our protagonist, Yugi, after solving the Millennium Puzzle, gets into a lot of weird scenarios where the way to solve the situation is to play a game. Whether it be terrorists threatening to blow up a Ferris wheel, scummy shoe salesman who loves scorpions, or one of the ugliest Bruce Lee impersonators I've ever seen. God, you can land airplanes on those eyebrows. Hachi would be proud. There are a lot of fun stories and characters in the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga, even before the takeover of the card game element, especially with the wide variety of games. Kazuki Takahashi loved games, and it really showed in the OG manga, but for the purposes of this video, there are two games that are really important, since it's a combination of both of them. The first is Capsule Monster Chess, otherwise known as Capmon, a game where players use small monsters on a board and would take turns moving the pieces across it and attacking other players' monsters. The winner is determined by whoever's pieces remain at the end. That's really the gist of the game you need to know for so far. The other one is Monster World, a tabletop RPG similar to the iconic Dungeons & Dragons game that most people know about nowadays. The thing to note is that unlike a lot of people who are familiar with D&D, that the dice used in the game were a pair of 10-sided ones. The lower you rolled, the better you do, with a 99 being a critical fumble and a 0-0 being a super critical. Now I bring these two games up because the game we're talking about today, Monster Capsule GB, takes both of them and merges them together, all mixed up in a pixel art style that looks a lot like Generation 1 of Pokemon. Which, hey, this game originally was released in the year 2000 and it's got that old school charm to it. So now that we got that out of the way, what's the game actually about? It takes place after the Death Tea arc and Monster World arc as well, which somehow the Millennium Ring made its way to a comatose Seto Kaiba, possessing him and using his body since his original consciousness was shattered by Yami Yugi. Now, you've got the demented mind of Bakura in the body of Seto Kaiba with access to all the money and assets he has. That is very frightening when you think about it. With a new body and God knows how much money, the possessed Kaiba invites Yugimoto and his friends over to the Duel Tower for a tournament. Hey Yug, why are you accepting Kaiba's invitation for this? Well, I think Kaiba deserves another chance. Yug, Kaiba hired a serial killer and almost killed me the last time we tangled with Kaiba. Where's this confidence coming from? Oh, that's the past, Joey. What's the worst that could happen? Damn it, Yugi, I ain't got a nose anymore! Brooklyn Rage! As you can imagine, Yugi's friends get their souls put into monster capsules that are based on them. Thus, it's up to Yugi to go and save his friends, and his grandpa, competing in the Monster World Tournament and using monster capsules at the best of his abilities. It's a simple premise, but one that I really enjoy. I've stated in previous videos when talking about Yugioh games that the original world of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a fascinating one, especially when you consider that the continuity continues to the end of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, of it being in the same world. Maybe. Don't know. So, when given a chance, being in this world is fascinating, and even more so when you play with the actual story of Yu-Gi-Oh! 2, because the story here really feels like it's fanfiction done right. And I'm not talking about the typical Yu-Gi-Oh! Fanfiction where people turn the characters into vampires and make them gay.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, of course not.
I'm talking about the fanfiction that explores the possibilities of the premise. Like, what if Kaiba was possessed by the spirit of the Millennium Ring, a concept that was considered back in Duelist Kingdom, only with the younger Kaiba? I'd go more into the actual narrative of the story, but there isn't really a lot to go through. I'm not going to say it's horrible, but it's really simple. There are some fun things, like how characters like Rex Raptor, who weren't in the original manga up until the Duelist Saga, were brought up, getting a bit more depth. Or My Valentine, who teases Yugi with, well, I couldn't stop thinking about you, so I entered the tournament. Once again, Mai is in her 20s, and Yugi is at best 16. Man, you're gonna be crushing Joey's heart, Mai, and maybe get some visits from the police later. Ugh. Now that I've effectively made the 3 people in my audience mad, let's continue onwards. While the story itself isn't anything groundbreaking, it's a Game Boy game from over 20 years ago. It's not offensively bad, and hey, at the very least, when you're facing against the Dark Masters, they each put you into a different scenario where exploring the world, doing typical D&D stuff, you know, saving the princess, stopping evil cultists from summoning a giant moth, having 2 kingdoms come to peace by defeating a giant 2-headed king Rex, and babysitting a dragon. You know, typical D&D stuff if you ask me. It's more to act like a framing device for the game, and there's nothing wrong with that. There have been plenty of games where it's lighting the story in service of the gameplay, especially older games. So let's talk about that gameplay, shall we? Aside from swiping the look from Pokemon, Monster Capsule GB takes a few elements from the Pokemon games as well, with it being a monster collecting game. You use these creatures that you get from Gashapon machines to battle other people, each using up to 4 monsters on a 6x6 grid, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. When you start the game, you're given a few star chips. These are not only your lifelines, since you've run out of these star chips, you get a game over. But these are also necessary currency since you need to spend star chips in order to get monsters from the Gashapon machines on each level and use these star chips to unlock the Dark Masters of each floor. They're the lifeblood of the game, and you get them by progressing and fighting against other characters in the game. Well, normally. So you need to have a bit of a balance when you're spending your star chips. Do you use what you got to get some new monster capsules, or do you save them all so you can challenge a Dark Master? Now look, I know how Pokemon card games work nowadays, so it's really easy to spend all your star chips in one place. Right off the bat though, the game gives the player a choice on what they want to do. Do you want to spend most of your chips trying your hand to get some decent monsters, or do you want to do the bare minimum so you can save your chips and challenge the Dark Master of the floor? Personally speaking, the best way to go about it is to get at least 3 monsters and start battling the randos who are on the floors to farm some star chips. You'll have to manage the star chip economy in order to have a balance on getting new monsters while maintaining enough chips to progress. It's necessary to do since you'll want to have as many monsters as you can, because if one of them dies in battle, that's it. It's gone. And if all your monsters are gone, that's a game over, my friends. But you have to put them in battle since that's the only way they can gain experience. Yes, your monsters can become stronger in each battle by battling other monsters. Each monster has 4 stats aside from its level. It's HP, attack, defense, and speed. The first 3 should be easy to understand since they're basic stats used in a lot of other RPGs. Health points, damage dealt, and damage resistance respectively. But speed is a little different. You see, when you actually play the combat system, your monsters can only move 1 space at a time. Speed actually determines the accuracy for your attacks. Whoever thought it was a good idea to conflate the two must have read a few too many of the aforementioned vampire Yu-Gi-Oh fanfictions and went insane over that. Still, these stats will determine the power of your monster pieces, so theoretically you can have every monster be a powerhouse with the best stats and have a low level. Obviously some monsters will have better starting stats, but there are ways to improve them. Each time you battle, your participating monsters will gain experience. and they each gain the same amount of EXP, and every time one of them levels up, they will gain a stat boost. There are also items in the game that you can raise your monster stats as well by using them on them, but you can get them either through finding them while in the Dark Master stages as random items, or the Gashapon devices will have a chance to give you one to use. Now this sounds bog standard, and that's perfectly fine. You don't need to reinvent the wheel to make a great game, but there are some changes to, say, like the OG Pokemon. For example, there are some pieces that can evolve. Not all of them, but just a select few. Much like the stat boosting items, you'll need to have a special one in order to make them evolve, but if you do, you'll have to restart from the bottom with the monster since its stats will be halved and its level reset to 1. It's a risk-reward system. Do you keep the monster you put so much time and energy into that has a better stat block, or do you evolve it to improve the monster and train it more? It's basic, and much like the actual card game, it has a lot more depth to it. Only you don't need to slap on a $50 price tag on some of the better monsters in the game. The outside battle mechanics can offer some good risk and reward situations. Of course, we need to talk about said battle system too. If you're familiar with things like Fire Emblem, the grid-based combat, only on a 6x6 tile battlefield, will be familiar. Each of the tiles are occupied by either a monster or terrain, because at the start of every battle, both players choose up to 4 monsters, and the player's monsters at the bottom of the screen and the enemies at the top. When you start a match, you can choose 4 monsters and place them on the bottom 2 rows of the board. And after your opponent places their monsters, you get the first turn typically, and each piece can move and attack, or you can skip your turn. It's relatively simple, but considering how sometimes the enemies will just skip their turns doing nothing, I guess nothing in the world is perfect. Damn it. The real complexity comes with the monsters and the board itself. Let's start with the board. Most people who are familiar with the OG anime of Yu-Gi-Oh! Will probably be familiar with the Duelist Kingdom field bonus. You know the system where you played certain monster types, they get a field power bonus that would give them the percentage of power and some other things too that are bullshit? Field power bonuses aren't exactly a new thing in Yu-Gi-Oh! Games. Hell, Duelists of the Roses and Reshuffle Destruction often use field bonuses as part of their key gameplay. But with this game, it does it a little differently since we're working with monsters instead of cards. Terrains will give specific pieces bonuses, and each piece will have its own terrain preference, which is displayed on the monster stat screen, which boosts its accuracy and even some damage too. At least in my experience, interpretation can be wrong. Still, players can take turns to move their pieces, and this is where the real strategy comes into play. Each piece has its own unique attack pattern. Some monsters can attack multiple panels, sometimes forward panels, or behind them, beside them, or even a zigzag pattern too. Every enemy monster in the range of your attacks will get hit, so it's always good to consider placement of not only your pieces, but your enemies as well, especially since their pieces have the same constraints, so you have to learn their patterns so you don't carelessly step into the attack range of your enemies and get beat up. Except for the monsters that can attack everything on the field, and those guys can get fucked. But otherwise, it's a fun system that encourages you to experiment with your pieces and finding what works with you. I personally enjoyed using Winged Dragon Guardian of the Fortress number 1, which when you use skill capsules can improve its attack range and have some good range for it. Oh yeah, skill capsules. They have the ability to improve your monster's attack, which can also improve their range and power. So it's always a good thing to try to get your hands on those. Much like the aforementioned stat boosting, you can get them either in the monster worlds, or you can get them from the Gashapon machines. On paper, this entire system doesn't sound bad, but the real complexity comes from your pieces and placement on the board. You won't know what piece your opponent will typically have or where they'll place them. Most you know is the terrains, so you'll more than likely have to focus on the monsters who will get the bonus on the field. And while your monsters will get leveled up and you will start with lower level monsters, even if you lose a monster in battle, the floors outside the Dark Master Trials will be littered with Gashapon machines. And all it takes is one star chip to get a new monster that replaces it, and even more so, those monsters will have their levels scaled up to the floor, so the losses aren't too bad. The core gameplay element has a lot of potential with it. You essentially take the world of Yu-Gi-Oh!, slap on the monster collecting elements of Pokemon, and throw in the permadeath feature of Fire Emblem, and you got yourself a system that can be rewarding with some good risk-reward factors. Though this wouldn't be a Yu-Gi-Oh! Game without some level of bullshit.
Bullshit!
Know that when I'm about to get into the critiques of the game, I want to stress that I enjoy it. I think it's a fine concept, and if Yu-Gi-Oh! Had actually taken this route into, say, the PS2 version of Monster Capsule Coliseum, I think this would have made a game a lot more interesting and memorable. But as a game critic, I am beholden to be honest to my audience to some level degree. I wouldn't want to be your typical Yu-Gi-Oh! Villain or pathetic YouTuber just to gaslight my audience into buying a game. Monster Capsule GB is one of those games. You know, the kind of game where until the run button was introduced, it would be a drag to get through some sections of it. It's kind of the same thing here in this game. Whenever you're in the mini RPG sections of it, you're forced at this slow pace, and throw in the fact that there are times where you'll have to power through screen after screen after screen to get to your destination, it can take a lot of time and be soul-crushing. Even more so when you factor in that there are maze-like corridors that can go on for a couple of screens. What's weird is that in the regular overworld, there is a run button that allows Yugi to move faster, but in the monster worlds, nope, you're stuck at going 5 miles per hour. Even the more peaceful areas like towns, you are basically capped at this one speed and can't go any faster. Now, there's a logical explanation for this, and that's whenever you're in the monster world, you're plagued with one of gaming's most infamous mechanics: random encounters.
The bear start eating the face.
Much like the dreaded turn-based combat and people who won't shut up about how graphics are the sole reason for why games are great art, random encounters tend to get under people's skins. Of course, how Monster Capsule GB handles them is a little different. Instead of just having a random encounter when you're walking around the right places, you get a set amount of steps before you're given a dice roll. When you enter a dungeon, you're explicitly told how many steps you can take before you get a dice roll and a percentage. So, for example, every 10 steps, the dice will roll, and if you get a 40 or lower, you'll get a random encounter which activates the combat system. This on its own isn't a bad thing, but because of the bare-bones nature of the system, this can waste a lot of time. But it's not a huge issue, and I'll explain why, mainly because of how I play the game.
Hey, you know who lives in this house? A great big phony!
Another issue to bring up is the grinding. Around the 4th and 5th Dark Masters, there's a significant difficulty spike with the monsters and bosses being a fair bit stronger and higher leveled. And unfortunately, a lot of characters you face off don't give a lot of experience, mainly because most of them just use 1 or 2 monsters on their fields. There are precisely 2 characters that you can face that give a bit better amount of experience. The first is Mako Tsunami and the second is Bones, with Bones being an objectively better choice since he gives a lot more experience and can be easier. They're on different floors, but once you unlock a door, you can easily return to previous floors with no problem. The problem is, this is a very grindy system, which ties into the previous complaint of time wasting. The game has a big issue with fluff. Or, it would if I didn't play it in the Early Days collection. For those who don't know, the Early Days collection has an enhancement ability that you can access before selecting a game. This basically has things such as having a copy of every card in the game, or removing certain limitations. In the case of Monster Capsule GB, you get 2 enhancements. Basically, you're given infinite star chips and infinite stat boosting capsules. Now, I am all for removing some of the more tedious aspects of the game, but I really have to wonder why some companies are so allergic to adding a speed up button in these kinds of old games. I remember back when Pokemon Stadium was new and I was a little runt, and I unlocked the Doduo and Dorio towers where you could play Pokemon games at twice and thrice speeds on the big screen. It only fixed a lot of issues I had with old school Pokemon games, though I'd still like to see that be implemented in other older games when brought to a more modern time. There is one aspect I do need to bring up with the Early Days collection that does make a big change with the game.
You're a phony!
I'm sure some of my background footage gave it away, but there is a rewind feature where you can hold down a button and rewind up to a minute of the game. So it's easy to really abuse in this one, especially with the dice rolls for attacks and the random encounters. Don't want to deal with a lot of random encounters? Just rewind a bit. Move or don't move Yugi and you get a different result until you can continue. Same thing with the battle system. Just re-roll until you get a result you want. Though I will point out there are moments where it's apparent to me that you will get a terrible roll, especially in the combat. No matter how many times I re-rolled, I would get that result. So I'd have to rewind again in order to choose a different piece, and that would clear up most part of the issue. It's obvious this wasn't actually considered for the first iteration of this game because this can break it to some degree. But considering that it's either spending a few seconds to re-roll the dice as opposed to a minute or 2 in the combat, it's something most players would do, especially when they're dealing with a lot of the other aspects that slow down the gameplay. It's not that the battle system is bad, in fact, it's actually pretty fun, but too much of anything will be detrimental to your health. Too much water, too much sunlight, too much BS. It's a shame because, much like every other Yu-Gi-Oh game, there's a lot of potential with this concept and combat system. You've got a game where you combine the elements of a monster collector that ties into the resource management that forces players to make decisions on whether to spend on the main resource for more monsters or to challenge the boss. Throw in the fact that there's a permadeath for your monsters, and you've got a really good risk-reward system going on, all tied together with a fun story concept that, while not the deepest thing in the world, still gives the player motivation and a good starting point to play the game. You've got the basis for an amazing game, and while the game itself is fun right now, it's held back by some of these issues.
Because I know somewhere deep down in my heart, I still love you.
Then again, I wouldn't say these flaws hold the game back too badly. We are talking about a game that's about a quarter century old. It was originally made for the Game Boy, and frankly, with this level of quality at the time of the system, I'm honestly impressed. Monster Capsule GB is flawed, but when I played it, it was something I wished more and more people could play, and thanks to the early days collection, people now can. Throw in the fact that the game is fully translated, even going so far to use the actual English dubbed names for the characters in it, you can tell there was a push to actually get people to enjoy it. That to me says a lot of how Konami and Digital Escape went about translating the Japanese-only titles into English for this collection. Granted, I do have issues with the early days collection as a whole, since I feel their quality of life changes are rather paltry. Again, the lack of a speed-up option is really holding the game back, and there are other issues as well, like the $40 price tag. Or if you want another example, the friggin' censor I complained about in my Rechef video is still in this. Why would you include that when there are mods already out there that prove you can code over it? Still, if you're willing to give this game a shot, I would recommend Monster Capsule GB, and if you're not willing to be a sucker like me and pay $40 for the early days collection, then you should consider checking out the transition by Boundly. Sorry if I didn't get your name right. Regardless, I'm MangaKamen, and enjoy good games, my friends. Later!